My name is Hannah Pierce, and the sound of my mother's laughter still echoes in my head like the snap of a bone. It happened at my graduation dinner, supposed to be the night when years of sleepless work finally meant something. We were in a high-end restaurant in downtown Austin, candles flickering against the windows, my diploma still warm in my purse. I had imagined this moment for years, a night of pride, of redemption. Instead, it became the moment that split my life into two. "So tell us again, sweetheart, my mother," Margaret said, swirling her wine with that sharp smile that never reached her eyes. "What is it you're doing now? Some kind of computer thing?" Her tone was sugar-coated contempt. "I'm finalizing a merger," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "FortisLink is joining with Sentinel Corp." My father, Thomas, cleared his throat. "Merging sounds risky." My younger brother, Caleb, grinned. "Sounds imaginary." And then my mother laughed loud, musical cruel. "You'll never make it, Hannah. Stop pretending you're some tech genius. You were always too sensitive for business." The laughter spread like perfume, subtle toxic filling the room. Even the waiter hesitated before pouring more wine. My chest burned, but I smiled because that's what daughters do when they've learned that showing pain is weakness. I reached for my glass, my fingers trembling only slightly, and the reflection in the wine showed a woman I barely recognized, composed, calm, broken. The conversation moved on without me to Caleb's upcoming police training, to Thomas's new fishing trip, all while my mother's words looped inside my skull. "You'll never make it." The same phrase she had whispered at every milestone, from my first science fair win to my first software pitch. It was her favorite prophecy, and she never missed a chance to repeat it. My phone buzzed on the table, silent vibration beneath the white linen. I glanced down. One email. "Subject line: merger approved. Congratulations." The letters blurred for a second before coming into focus. The deal was real. Years of code failure, rejection, caffeine, and debt had just turned into a $780 million valuation. I swallowed hard. My heartbeat slowed. The heat in my chest shifted from humiliation to something cold, sharp, electric. "Excuse me," I said softly. "I need to take this call." My mother waved her hand. "Of course you do, dear. Go play CEO." More laughter. I stood up the chair, scraping softly against the floor. As I walked away, I felt the weight of her gaze between my shoulder blades, the same gaze that once made me doubt my worth. Not tonight. Outside, under the Austin skyline, I opened the email again, letting the glow of the screen wash over my face. My hands still shook, but not from pain anymore. It was power quiet, trembling, unstoppable power. And for the first time in my life, her laughter didn't hurt. It fueled me. I was born in Georgetown, Texas, the kind of small town where everyone knows your middle name and your parents' opinions about everything. My father, Thomas Pierce, served in the Army before becoming a logistics manager, a man of few words and rigid rules. My mother, Margaret, taught English at the local high school and made perfection her religion. Our house was neat, silent, and suffocating. We weren't a family. We were a performance. From as early as I can remember, I understood that love in our house had terms and conditions. Margaret believed in order and image and respectability. She believed in sons. My younger brother Caleb could spill orange juice on her new carpet and she'd laugh it off. But if I brought home a 98 on a math test instead of 100, she'd tilt her head and say, "What happened to the other 2 points, Hannah?" I used to think that if I just worked harder, I could earn her approval. That belief nearly destroyed me. At school, I loved machines. While other girls painted their nails, I built circuits out of old radios my neighbor threw away. When I was 12, I entered a state robotics competition and won. My teacher hugged me. The principal called my parents. Margaret arrived late, wearing that polite smile she used in public. "That's nice, dear," she said, glancing at the trophy. "But you should learn to cook. It's more useful." The teacher's smile faltered, but I just nodded. I learned early that defying her wasn't worth the price. Thomas stayed quiet through most of it. He was a man who believed that silence was strength, that emotions were weaknesses. His favorite phrase was, "Discipline builds character." Mine was, "Silence builds scars." When I got accepted into the University of Texas at Austin with a full scholarship for computer science, I thought maybe this would be different. Maybe this time she would be proud. I remember the dinner vividly. She sat across from me, her pearl earrings catching the kitchen light. "That's wonderful," she said. "But don't let this distract you from real life. Tech isn't stable. Besides, men don't like women who are too ambitious." My father nodded in agreement, fork tapping against his plate. Caleb smirked. "Guess I'll be the successful one." I smiled politely and finished my food in silence. That night, lying in bed, I realized something bitter and clear. Their version of love was a contract I would never be able to sign. When I left for college, Margaret hugged me like she was lending me out to the world, not letting me go. "Remember, she said the world doesn't owe you anything." I wanted to reply, "Neither do you," but I swallowed the words. As the bus pulled away from Georgetown, I watched her fade through the window, standing with her arms crossed, already waiting for me to fail. It should have hurt, but instead it lit a fire I didn't know I had. That was the day I made a silent vow I would never need her permission again. I would build something so solid, so undeniable that not even her laughter could tear it down. College was freedom disguised as exhaustion. At the University of Texas, I studied computer science and business while working 2 part-time jobs to cover what scholarships didn't. During the day, I coded until my wrists ached. At night, I stocked shelves at a convenience store or helped grade papers in the computer lab. My professors admired my drive, but they didn't see what powered it. Rage, wrapped in politeness, a lifetime of being told I couldn't. In my sophomore year, I met Oliver Grant, a visiting lecturer who had sold his own logistics startup to a major corporation years ago. He was tall, silver-haired, and spoke softly, the kind of calm that comes from surviving failure and success alike. After one of his lectures about market disruption, I waited until the room emptied out. "Do you think someone like me could start a company?" I asked. "Someone like you," he repeated. "You mean someone underestimated?" I nodded. He smiled slightly. "That's usually the best kind." That sentence changed my life. Oliver became my quiet mentor, reviewing my prototypes and helping me see how technology could solve real-world inefficiencies. By junior year, I had developed a software model that optimized supply chains for small distributors, the same industry my father worked in but refused to modernize. When I told my parents about it over Thanksgiving, Margaret's response was predictable. "Supply chains. That's what your father's been doing for 30 years. You think you can outsmart him." My father didn't look up from carving the turkey. "Software can't replace trucks, Hannah." I smiled tightly. "It can make the trucks smarter." Caleb snorted. "You talk like you're running NASA." Their laughter filled the dining room, echoing in my ribs. I excused myself, stepping onto the porch where the November wind felt cleaner than their approval ever had. That night, I opened my laptop and registered my first company name, Pierce Logic. I didn't tell them. Over the next 2 years, Oliver helped me refine the product, connecting me to local angel investors who gave me $80,000 in seed money. It wasn't much, but it was oxygen. I worked out of my apartment, living on ramen and black coffee. Every success was followed by a new rejection. Most potential clients were polite until they realized I was 22 and female. Then their tone changed. "You're impressive," they'd say, "but maybe bring in someone more experienced, a male partner." Perhaps I'd smile, shake their hands, and leave my jaw aching from holding back everything I wanted to say. By senior year, I'd signed 2 clients, small distributors in San Antonio, who were desperate to save money on routing. When the system worked, it cut their fuel costs by 12%. That result got attention. One client introduced me to a logistics executive in Dallas. He became my first major contract and the validation I'd been craving since childhood. I called my mother that night, thinking stupidly that she'd finally be proud. "Mom," I said, "I just signed a deal worth 6 figures." There was silence on the other end. Then her voice, calm, detached. "I hope it's legitimate. A lot of scams out there targeting naive girls." Something inside me snapped. "You mean women?" I corrected. "No," she said coolly. I meant what I said. That was the last time I called home for approval. From then on, I built quietly, strategically, methodically. Every line of code became a declaration of independence. Every investor meeting was a rebellion in heels and restraint. When Pierce Logic finally reached profitability at 24, I bought a one-way ticket to Austin for a dinner that would change everything. the graduation celebration where my mother's laughter would echo one last time before the world learned what her daughter had built. Success has a cruel habit of pretending to be stable right before it collapses. 6 months after I launched Pierce Logic full-time, my biggest client, a national distributor, called to say they were terminating our contract. Their system had crashed after ignoring my installation guidelines, but in the press release that followed, they blamed us entirely. Overnight, my inbox turned into a graveyard of cancellations. The 2 interns I had could barely look at me. I maxed out 3 credit cards trying to cover payroll before I realized I couldn't save what was already burning. For the first time, I felt what my mother had always predicted, a failure so public it made my skin crawl. I didn't sleep for days. My apartment smelled like cold coffee and anxiety. I finally called home, swallowing the pride that had always kept me from dialing that number. Margaret answered on the second ring. "Well," she said after I explained, "I suppose this was inevitable. I told you technology is a bubble. Maybe it's time to come home, Hannah. Get a real job. Something respectable." Respectable. The word scraped against my ears. "I'm not quitting," I said. "You don't have a choice, dear. The world doesn't reward stubborn little girls." I hung up before she could say more. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped the phone. I sat there, knees pulled to my chest, realizing she wasn't just waiting for me to fail, she needed me to fail. It justified her worldview. I hated how right she might be. For 2 days, I barely moved. Then on the 3rd morning, there was a knock on my door. It was Oliver Grant, holding 2 coffees and wearing that quiet expression of people who've lived through storms. "You look terrible," he said gently. "Good. That means you're about to grow." I laughed bitterly. "I'm done. No one trusts me now." He set the coffees down. "Then rebuild their trust or build your own. But stop sitting in the ashes pretending the fire won't burn you again. Learn from it." I told him I was out of money. He slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a check, $100,000. "Consider this my second and final investment," he said. "Not in your company, in your capacity to get up." My throat tightened. "I can't pay you back." "You already will," he said, "when you stop needing to prove them wrong." Those words settled into my chest like a seed waiting for sunlight. I rebuilt everything from scratch. I dissolved Pierce Logic and founded a new company, FortisLink. The name came from the Latin for strong connection. I moved operations into a shared workspace in Austin where I spent 18 hours a day coding and rewriting contracts with painful precision. The nights were long, the loneliness heavier than failure itself. There were times I'd wake up at my desk with my face against the keyboard, dreams full of my mother's laughter and my father's silence. But little by little, FortisLink grew. I found new clients who believed in me, who trusted what I'd learned the hard way. I built a team that valued honesty over appearances. When Oliver visited again months later, he found me surrounded by coffee cups, papers, and a small group of engineers. "I see you chose to lead," he said. I smiled for the first time in months. No one else was going to. That night, after everyone left, I opened my old voicemails. One was from Margaret, recorded before the collapse. "Remember, failure builds character." I deleted it without listening to the rest. My character was built now, brick by brick, scar by scar, and this time it would stand. 2 years later, FortisLink had grown from a cramped co-working space into a real company with 26 employees and contracts across the Midwest. We specialized in AI-driven logistics, helping distributors cut costs through predictive routing and secure data management. The irony that I had built what my father once called a fantasy never escaped me. Our clients were companies like his, only smarter. The moment that shifted everything came on an ordinary Tuesday when Oliver walked into my office holding a letter from Sentinel Corp, one of the largest logistics networks in the country. They wanted to acquire FortisLink's proprietary algorithm and merge the development division into their expansion project. "This is the kind of offer people dream about," he said. "But it'll test you, Hannah. You're negotiating with wolves." I studied the letter, heart pounding. The deal was valued at over $700 million in equity and cash, but if handled wrong, they'd absorb us completely and erase my name from what I had built. I had seen that happen to other founders' men twice my age with degrees from Stanford and egos twice the size of Texas. I refused to be a ghost in my own success story. I called our legal consultant, drafted a proposal that would preserve control of our technology, and spent nights preparing for battle. The negotiations stretched for weeks, and every time Sentinel's executives tried to talk over me, I leaned in sharper, colder, steadier. When they told me to bring in someone senior, I brought Oliver. When they underestimated my valuation model, I brought proof of efficiency improvements that outperformed their projections by 42%. By the end of the month, Sentinel's tone had changed from patronizing to impressed. The merger was sealed with me as the youngest retained executive in the company's history. But beneath the thrill, something inside me trembled. Success came with a cost I hadn't calculated. My friends disappeared under the weight of my schedule. My health cracked under caffeine and stress. I lived inside conference rooms and airports, my only constants being deadlines and fluorescent lights. When Oliver noticed my hollow eyes, he pulled me aside. "What you're building is powerful," he said, "but power without peace becomes poison." I nodded, pretending to listen, but inside I knew it was too late. I had become addicted to proving people wrong, especially one person. When Sentinel's board announced a press event to celebrate the merger, I was invited to speak as co-founder. It happened to fall on the same week as my graduation from the master's program I'd been completing part-time. My mother called when she heard. "So, you're finally finishing something," she said dryly. "Will you be too busy playing boss to attend?" I told her I would attend both. "Then maybe," she laughed, "this time you'll manage not to embarrass yourself." Her words slid under my skin like ice. I told her there would be a graduation dinner, a small family one, my treat. She sounded surprised, but accepted. I didn't tell her that Sentinel's final approval would arrive that same night. I wanted the timing to speak for itself. I wanted her to hear that laugh again and watch it die in her throat. I wasn't seeking revenge exactly. It was something colder, quieter, a need for balance, for truth, to tip the scales that had always been against me. The universe, it seemed, was about to deliver that chance in the most poetic way possible. The restaurant was one of those places my mother used to call pretentious, all glass walls, gold accents, and waiters who whispered. I booked the private dining room weeks in advance, knowing how she loved appearances. If she was going to dismiss me, it would be in a place where the chandeliers would remember it. I arrived early, nerves masked beneath a sleek black dress and the calm of someone who had fought too long to shake. My phone buzzed with messages from Sentinel's legal team, final signatures, final numbers, final validation. I turned the screen face down just as the host opened the door. Margaret Pierce entered first, wearing the same pearl earrings she'd worn at every significant event of my life, as though tradition could disguise cruelty. My father followed stoic and heavy, his posture announcing disappointment before his words ever could. Caleb strolled in last, all charm and casual arrogance, clapping me on the shoulder. "Look at you, sis. Fancy." "It's a special night," I said evenly. The waiter poured wine. Margaret lifted her glass first. To Hannah, she said with a tight smile, "For proving she can survive without coming home in tears." The toast landed like a slap wrapped in lace. I raised my glass anyway. "To family," I said, "even when it teaches us what not to become." Her smile faltered for half a second before returning sharper. We ordered. They spoke mostly to each other, Caleb about his new promotion, Thomas about the new fishing boat. I listened quietly, a spectator in my own family. Then Margaret turned to me with that familiar glint. "So, tell us, dear, are you still doing that little computer thing, the one that went bankrupt?" I looked at her, feeling something inside me click like the final piece of a lock falling into place. "No," I said softly. "That company is gone. I built another." Caleb smirked. "Another startup." "How long before this one tanks?" "This one doesn't tank," I said. "It merges." Margaret's laughter rang out across the table, polished and cruel. "You'll never make it, Hannah. Stop pretending. You were never cut out for the real world." For a moment, time folded. I was 10 again, standing with a trophy in my hand while she told me to learn to cook. I was 17, hearing her say, "No man would want a girl who codes." I was 22, calling home to share my first contract, only to be told it must be a scam. And then I was 24 sitting across from her in a candlelit room, knowing the email waiting on my phone would silence her forever. I smiled, calm and deliberate. "You might be right, Mom," I said quietly. "Maybe I'm not cut out for your world." My phone buzzed once, the sound soft but sharp. I turned the screen just enough to see the subject line "Merger Confirmed." Fortis Link X Sentinel. Press release 8:00 p.m. The clock on the wall read 7:58. My heart didn't race. It steadied. I set the phone face down again, folded my napkin, and looked directly at her. "But maybe I said your world's a little smaller than mine." Thomas frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" I opened the phone and slid it toward them. The headline glowed under the chandelier light. "Sentinel Corp announces historic merger with FortisLink. Retained executive Hannah Pierce, age 24. The silence that followed was almost holy. Margaret blinked. Caleb's jaw slackened. My father leaned forward, reading again as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less impossible. Then Margaret's lips parted, but no sound came. It was the first time I'd ever seen her speechless. The waiter entered just then with the champagne I'd ordered ahead. "Congratulations, Miss Pierce," he said cheerfully. "On the merger. Quite an accomplishment." Margaret looked up sharply, color draining from her face. Caleb muttered something about needing air. I raised my glass once more. "To mothers," I said, my tone soft, almost kind. "For teaching their daughters what resilience really looks like." She didn't laugh this time. She just stared, her reflection trembling in the glass. The dinner ended in fragments, half-finished plates, unfinished words, the quiet hum of a room unsure whether to clap or whisper. My mother sat frozen for most of it, her expression a portrait of disbelief and embarrassment. The kind of humiliation she had inflicted on others for decades now reflected back like a mirror she could not escape. My father tried to salvage dignity, clearing his throat between awkward compliments that meant nothing. "Well," he said, adjusting his napkin, "I suppose you've done well for yourself." His tone wasn't pride. It was surrender. Caleb muttered something about timing his voice thick with jealousy. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The world had answered for me. When we left the restaurant, the Texas night air was heavy with heat and silence. My mother walked ahead, her heels clicking like metronomes of anger. My father lagged behind, already pretending this dinner had never happened. Outside, the valet handed me my keys. Margaret turned to me just as I was about to open my car door. "You've made your point," she said coldly. "Congratulations. But success doesn't make you kind, Hannah. Don't forget who raised you." I looked at her, then really looked at the woman who taught me to hide pain behind posture, who confused control with love, who built her world on belittling what she didn't understand. "I haven't forgotten," I said. "That's why I'm nothing like you." Her lips tightened. "You'll regret talking to me like that someday." "Maybe," I said softly, "but not tonight." I got in the car, shut the door, and drove away without looking back. I made it halfway across the bridge before my phone buzzed. The sound startled me, still raw from the adrenaline. It was from Margaret. One new message. I hesitated before opening it. The text was short. "Don't expect any help from us when it falls apart." I laughed once, a hollow, shocked sound that caught in my throat. Even now, even after the public proof, she couldn't resist predicting failure. For her, my success wasn't a revelation. It was an inconvenience. I pulled over, staring at the river lights dancing across the windshield. Then another notification flashed. A new email subject line. "Welcome to Sentinel Corp." It was official. My stock options had vested. My name was on the global announcement, distributed to every major business outlet by midnight. I exhaled slowly, the contrast so sharp it almost hurt. One message tore me down. The other built an empire. In that moment, something shifted permanently. The ache for her approval that had followed me my whole life finally disintegrated. I didn't need her to see me anymore. The world already did. The next morning, the headlines were everywhere. Young female CEO leads record-breaking logistics merger. The Texas engineer who redefined supply chain AI. The article included my photo, the one Oliver had taken for the press kit, a calm, steady gaze. No trace of the girl who once begged her mother to believe in her. My phone rang non-stop, reporters, investors, journalists. But the only call I waited for never came. My father didn't call. My mother didn't text again. The silence was its own answer. By evening, Sentinel's CFO invited me to join the board. My name was trending. My story was viral. And yet, sitting in my apartment surrounded by congratulatory flowers, I felt an odd emptiness. Victory, I realized, doesn't heal every wound, it just makes the scars shine differently. I scrolled through my contacts until I reached Oliver's name and hit call. When he answered, his voice was calm, proud. "You did it," he said. "Now, let's see what you do with it." And that night, under the quiet hum of the city, I finally understood success wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of my power. The days following the merger felt surreal, like walking through the dream I had chased for half a lifetime. Sentinel's headquarters in Dallas gleamed with glass and steel, the company logo etched into every surface like a promise. My first morning there, I stood before the boardroom window, looking down at a skyline that once felt unreachable. The press hailed me as the young visionary, the woman who redefined logistics intelligence, but beneath the headlines, my mind was still haunted by my mother's last text. "Don't expect any help when it falls apart." That message was a ghost whispering behind every meeting, every deal, every late night staring at quarterly projections. Success, I was learning, didn't quiet the voices, it only gave them better acoustics. Oliver noticed it first. "You're still chasing her," he said one afternoon as we reviewed strategy reports. "Not her approval, her defeat." I didn't deny it. Maybe I didn't want to. Part of me still wanted Margaret Pierce to understand that the girl she mocked had built something bigger than the house she worshipped. But Oliver was right. Anger builds momentum, not peace. That realization didn't come easy. The next month, Sentinel stock soared after our first quarterly earnings beat projections by 30%. I was invited to speak at a leadership conference in New York where executives twice my age asked for advice like I was some kind of oracle. That night in the hotel suite, I looked at the view of Manhattan's skyline and thought of Georgetown, of that small house where silence was punishment and laughter was cruelty. I thought of Caleb, of how he'd probably call me a show-off. I thought of my mother, who would likely be telling her friends I'd gotten lucky. The bitterness that should have tasted sweet instead felt heavy metallic. A week later, a journalist from Forbes called wanting to feature a human interest angle on my story. "A young woman who rose despite family doubt," he said. "It's inspiring." I laughed softly. "Despite or because of—" He paused. "Maybe both." The feature went viral. Within days, my inbox filled with messages from women across the country. Students, single mothers, entrepreneurs, sharing how my story reminded them they weren't crazy for wanting more. One message stood out from a woman in Dallas. "My mother says ambition makes women lonely. Maybe she's right, but maybe loneliness is just the tax for freedom." That line stayed with me. I began mentoring other young women through Sentinel's Innovation Incubator, something Oliver quietly encouraged. "Use your story," he said. "Turn your pain into a path." I did. Every session I taught felt like rewriting history, offering someone else the faith I never received. And still there was Margaret. She hadn't called, she hadn't texted, not once. Her silence was deliberate, an act of war disguised as indifference. But karma has a way of finding cracks. One afternoon, my assistant buzzed me. "You have a visitor," she said, "a Mrs. Pierce." I froze. When the door opened, there, she was my mother, smaller than I remembered her pride, wrapped tight around her like armor. She sat across from me without invitation. "Your father's retiring," she said. "Caleb's taking over the business." I nodded. "Congratulations to him." She hesitated, eyes flicking to the Sentinel logo behind me. "He could use your advice. You know, technology." There it was, the request she swore she'd never make. I met her gaze, calm and unwavering. "I thought you said computers were a phase." She blinked. "People change." "Do they?" I asked softly. The silence stretched between us until she stood. "Think about it," she said before leaving. I didn't. I'd already spent my whole life thinking about her. That night, I realized something simple and liberating. I had outgrown her voice. For the first time, her laughter didn't echo, it disappeared. 3 months later, the call came late at night when success had made my life too loud for peace. It was my father. His voice sounded older, cracked around the edges. "Your mother's in the hospital," he said, heart arrhythmia. "She asked for you." I froze. After everything, after the text, the silence, the humiliation, she wanted me. The irony hit like a wave. I took the first flight to Georgetown the next morning. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and unfinished apologies. When I stepped into her room, Margaret looked smaller than I'd ever seen her. The woman who once commanded every room now lay among wires and monitors, her voice barely a whisper. "You came," she said, half surprised. "You asked," I replied, taking the chair beside her bed. The silence that followed was thicker than years of unspoken things. "I read about you," she said finally. "They call you brilliant." "They do," I said quietly. "You don't sound proud." She exhaled, eyes distant. "Pride's complicated when you realize you were wrong too late." The words caught me off guard. I wasn't sure if they were an apology or a confession. "Why now?" I asked. "Why call me after all this time?" She closed her eyes briefly. "Because I was afraid I'd die before you heard me say it." Her voice cracked. "You were right, Hannah. About all of it. About what women can be. About what I never let myself become." The room fell silent except for the soft rhythm of her heart monitor. I didn't cry, not yet. I just watched the woman who had built her identity out of control finally lose it. "You don't have to forgive me," she whispered. "I wouldn't know what to do with forgiveness," I said. "But I can listen." She nodded slowly, tears sliding down her temples. For the first time, I saw not the critic, not the matriarch, but the frightened girl she once must have been raised by a system that taught her fear disguised as discipline. She reached for my hand. Her grip was weak, but the gesture was strong enough to fracture years of distance. "I wanted to protect you," she said. "From failure, from pain." "You became both," I replied softly. A small smile ghosted across her lips. "Then I suppose you learned from the best." The next morning, she was stable enough to talk more, but I couldn't stay. Duty called as it always did. Before leaving, I leaned over her bed. "I'll check in next week," I said. "Rest." She squeezed my hand again. "Hannah," she whispered, "don't wait as long as I did to love." The words stayed with me all the way back to Austin. 2 weeks later, she died in her sleep. My father's voice on the phone was hollow. "She wanted you to have her pearls," he said, "the ones she wore to your graduation." I said thank you, though I didn't know why. The day of her funeral, I stood at the podium speaking not to the mother who mocked me, but to the woman who finally saw me, if only at the end. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. I said to the mourners, it's choosing to stop letting the pain control the story. My father sat in the front row, expression unreadable. Caleb didn't meet my eyes. When the service ended, I slipped one of her pearl earrings into my pocket, a relic of everything broken and everything learned. As I walked out under the Texas sun, I realized that grief, like success, didn't need an audience. It needed acceptance. And somewhere deep beneath the ache, I felt something shift closure, fragile but real. After the funeral, I drove alone back to Austin, the radio off the road, stretching endless through fields that looked exactly as they had when I was a teenager dreaming of escape. But now the landscape felt different, smaller, almost gentle. Death has a way of resizing everything, even the past. When I arrived at my apartment, the first thing I noticed was the silence, not the empty kind, but the peaceful kind that doesn't demand anything from you. On my kitchen counter sat the box my father had sent Margaret's pearls. I opened it, half expecting judgment to rise like smoke, but instead I felt nothing except the faint scent of her perfume. I lifted the necklace, its weight delicate and familiar. For the first time, it didn't feel like a chain. A week later, Oliver invited me to lunch at the Sentinel Office Cafe. "You look different," he said as I sat down. "Lighter." I told him about the funeral, about the strange relief that came with final goodbyes. He listened, then nodded. "Grief is a teacher," he said, "the kind that makes you repeat the lesson until you finally understand it." I smiled faintly. And what was my lesson? That love doesn't always come in the language we needed, he said. Sometimes it comes broken. That evening, I stayed late at the office reviewing documents for a new project, an internal platform meant to support female founders through Sentinel's investment branch. The idea had come from that email months earlier, the one about loneliness being the tax for freedom. I decided I didn't want other women to pay it alone. I named the program the Fortis Initiative. By year's end, we had funded 15 startups led by women who reminded me of younger versions of myself, brilliant, determined, underestimated. Each success story felt like rewriting one of my mother's sentences, turning her doubts into evidence that she had been wrong about the limits of womanhood. When Forbes interviewed me again, I didn't talk about the merger or the money. I talked about legacy. Success, I said, isn't what you build for yourself. It's what survives when you stop chasing validation. The quote went viral, shared thousands of times. One night, while scrolling through the comments, I found one from an anonymous account. Your mother would be proud, it said. I didn't know who wrote it. Maybe my father, maybe a stranger, but I let myself believe it anyway. Around Christmas, my father called for the first time in months. His tone was softer, tentative. I wanted to thank you, he said, for the scholarship fund you named after your mother. I had forgotten to tell him about that. It was a small program we started to support women studying engineering at the University of Texas, the Margaret Pierce Memorial Grant. It felt right, I said quietly. She taught me discipline, even if she didn't mean to teach it that way. He exhaled. She was proud of you, you know. She just didn't know how to show it. I smiled sadly. Neither did you. He didn't deny it. We talked for a while longer, mostly about practical things, the weather, the board's transition plan, Caleb's new project, but beneath it all was something unfamiliar between us, respect. Not affection, not yet, but respect. After the call ended, I sat by the window, city lights flickering below like tiny embers, and I realized that every wound my parents gave me had turned into a lesson in strength. They hadn't built me to love softly. They built me to survive. And now, survival had turned into leadership. I reached for the pearl necklace and clasped it around my neck. Its cool touch against my skin felt like history making peace with itself. The next morning, I walked into Sentinel's boardroom to finalize the Fortis Initiative's next round of funding. For the first time, I wasn't proving anything. I was building something that would outlive me. The first anniversary of the merger arrived like a ghost I didn't know whether to celebrate or mourn. Sentinel threw a lavish gala downtown, a fundraiser under glittering chandeliers and branded champagne bottles. The media called it a year of transformation, but for me, it felt like a mirror I wasn't sure I wanted to face. I arrived in a sleek navy gown, the same color my mother once said made me look too serious for a girl. Oliver stood by the stage, grinning when he saw me. Look at you, he said, from dorm room code to corporate empire. I smiled. From ashes to algorithms. He laughed softly, but his eyes were proud. Later that night, when the CEO handed me the microphone to speak, I looked out at the audience, investors, executives, politicians, and saw my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows behind them. It was strange seeing the woman I had become, standing inside the dream that little girl from Georgetown used to whisper about under her blanket. When I started FortisLink, I wanted to build something efficient, intelligent, profitable. What I didn't realize was that I was also trying to build something my mother would finally believe in. The room went still. She never did. I said quietly, and that's okay. Because the moment I stopped needing her approval was the moment I became unstoppable. There was applause, but it sounded distant like ocean waves muffled by glass. Afterward, as the gala thinned out, Oliver found me standing by the window. You're not celebrating, he said. I am, I replied, just not loudly. He studied me for a long moment. What's next, Hannah? The question lingered. I thought of the young women from the Fortis Initiative, of the ones who sent emails about their first prototypes, their first hires, their first investors. Next, I said I help others build their own fortresses. He nodded, satisfied. That night, back at my apartment, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat before my vanity mirror. The pearls hung around my neck, glowing faintly against the navy fabric. For the first time, I didn't see my mother's reflection in my own face. I saw my own. I opened the top drawer where I kept the graduation photo she once refused to frame. In it, I stood between my parents, smiling too wide, trying too hard. I picked up a pen and wrote on the back, "Thank you for the fire." Then I placed it back in the drawer and closed it gently. The next morning, a letter arrived from my father. Handwritten, shaky. "I sold the company it began. The world is changing faster than I can keep up. Caleb's staying on, but I thought you should know it was your software they're integrating. Turns out the daughter's way was the better one." I read it twice, tears threatening, but never falling. The letter ended with 4 words that felt like the full circle I didn't know I needed. She would be proud. I folded it, slid it into the same drawer beside the photo, and whispered to the quiet room I already am. Outside, the sun broke over the Austin skyline, its light reflecting off the glass towers that bore the name Sentinel, but carried the heartbeat of FortisLink within them. I touched the pearls once more, their cool weight steady against my collarbone, and realized the name Pierce no longer hurt. It had transformed not into something I had to escape, but something I had finally redefined. I wasn't my mother's daughter anymore. I was my own. A year later, I returned to Georgetown for the first time since my mother's funeral. The town looked smaller than I remembered, the streets narrower, the houses more faded like a childhood memory, finally letting go of its power. I parked in front of the old Pierce house, the porch still painted the same dull white. The wind chimes still tangled and silent. My father had moved into a senior community on the outskirts of town, and Caleb ran what was left of the family business, now partnered with a technology supplier that ironically licensed FortisLink's software. I stood at the gate for a long time before walking inside. The house smelled like dust and lavender, faint and familiar. I wandered into my old room where the wallpaper had begun to peel at the edges. On the desk sat my old radio kit, the one I built when I was 12, the one my mother told me to throw away. I ran my fingers over it, feeling the texture of memory and defiance. It didn't make me sad anymore. It made me grateful. I heard footsteps behind me. Caleb leaned against the doorframe, hands in his pockets. "Didn't think you'd come back," he said. "Didn't think you'd still be here," I replied. He chuckled softly. "Somebody had to keep the lights on." His tone was lighter than I expected, almost respectful. "You did good, Hannah," he said after a pause. "Even Dad admits it now." I turned toward him. "And you," he shrugged. "I used to think you were trying to prove something. Now I think you were trying to survive." "I get that." The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. For the first time, it felt like we were speaking the same language. "You were always Mom's favorite," I said. "That wasn't your fault." He looked down. It didn't feel like a privilege. It felt like pressure. He hesitated before adding, "I think she was hardest on you because she saw what she could have been." I nodded slowly. Maybe that's the closest thing to love she knew how to give. We stood in silence for a moment, surrounded by ghosts that no longer hurt. Before leaving, I walked through the backyard where the oak tree still stood tall. I buried one of Margaret's pearls beneath its roots, not as a gesture of forgiveness, but as a symbol of transformation. Some legacies, I realized, weren't meant to be carried, they were meant to be planted. On the drive back to Austin, the sky turned gold over the fields. The radio played a song my mother used to hum while cooking, and instead of pain, I felt peace. When I returned to the city, Oliver met me at the office. "You look different," he said, "like someone who's finally finished a story." I smiled. "No, just someone who finally understands the ending." That evening, I recorded a short video message for the Fortis Initiative's next mentorship group. "My name is Hannah Pierce," I began. "And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that success without peace is just another form of failure. Don't build to prove them wrong. Build because you believe you're right. Build because the world needs your version of better." I paused before adding, "And when they laugh, let them. Sometimes laughter is just fear in disguise." The video went viral overnight, but I didn't read the comments this time. I didn't need to. The validation that once felt like oxygen was now just background noise. A week later, I stood on the balcony of Sentinel's new Austin headquarters, watching the sun rise over the river. The city pulsed with energy, alive with ambition, the same hunger that had once driven me through sleepless nights and endless rejection. Only now it didn't consume me, it fueled me. I had turned every wound into wisdom, every scar into a map. My phone buzzed once. A new message from an unknown number. Saw your speech. Reminded me of your mother's fire. I smiled, staring at the horizon. It's mine now, I whispered. The wind carried the words away, soft and final. For the first time, there was no war left to fight, no ghost left to chase. Just quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like coming home.